Economist David Owiro is the Executive Director of Africa Development Think Tank. He now joins us now via Skype from Nairobi in Kenya to talk about the negative effects COVID-19 will have on Africa's already ailing economies and employment. Mr. Owiro, thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to the Globe.
Thank you for having me.
Clearly, the global economy is heading into a recession as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, and Africa would be the hardest hit.
Yes, certainly. Unfortunately, this pandemic has come at such a critical point for African nations, particularly because of the financial pressures that they've had in terms of their public finances. As you know, most economies in Africa have been saddled with debt, and so it doesn't give them much room in terms of borrowing more debt so that they can put in place the economic measures required to provide safety nets and cushions for the critical sectors that the pandemic has affected.
Well, in as much as some African countries are making headway in terms of containing the coronavirus outbreak, but then can the same be said about its propensity, the economic propensity to deal with it?
There's certainly a big challenge. What we have now is two sort of reactions. So African nations have to provide a public health intervention, and so those have to do with how to contain the virus, how to manage it, and also how to sort of give interventions around the public health sector. On the other hand, also, they have to seek economic interventions so that their economies are not crippled with this pandemic. What we know now is that obviously all economic sectors are affected, because when you have self-quarantine and self-isolation, social distancing and partial quarantines in place, you obviously will not have the critical human capital that is required across all economic sectors. And therefore, we are definitely facing an economic depression. And so what is critical for countries to do is to put in place measures to sort of mitigate the adverse impacts that will likely result from this pandemic. And that's where it all matters, in as much as also the public health interventions are important.
Not only are African countries, fully integrated into the global economy, and some of the African states play a very crucial role in terms of exporting commodities, whose prices have fallen quite precipitously. So, can those African countries, be cushioned against a further deterioration of their economic stances?
So the challenge we have is that African economies are mostly informal. If you look at country-by-country comparisons, you'll find the informal sector comprising between 50% to even 80% of the economy in most of the countries. And so this, therefore, provides a big challenge in terms of providing the safety nets and cushions that perhaps countries might be thinking of in terms of economic measures, because you are limited only to the formal sector. And so if you look at the key sectors such as the services sector or even the agricultural value chains, a lot of input is in the informal sector, and that's where most jobs actually are provided. And so if you're talking about the impact on employment, it will be certainly quite adverse, and it becomes quite difficult to target those who work in those sectors in terms of safety nets and cushions. And so, yes, we do need these safety nets and cushioning measures, but they will have very little impact because of the limited nature of the formal sector across African economies.
Most economists, Mr. Owiro, paint a very bleak future about Africa and African economies. But then looking at the interventions that are already in place, such as, the drop in fuel prices, and some countries have already put in place tax rebates and tax incentives, will this not help?
It will help. It goes a long way, but it's not enough. It's not adequate in terms of a response. For instance, if we talk about the tax rebates that are in place, if incomes are depressed generally, it doesn't matter whether you have delays in tax submissions or even tax rebates. The reality is that there will be no incomes. And if companies across sectors are having to lay off and put on hold their expansion plans, you essentially will not have income for people who've been employed in those sectors. And so, yes, there is need to do much more, but we have to also recognize the limitation of the current measures that we have. I think we have to go beyond the formal sector. We have to think about putting in place measures that, cushion even the informal sector. I think that's, for me, what is critical at this stage in terms of identifying, the cadres that will be most affected, which sectors, plus the sectors that will be most affected, and providing some sort of, be it food subsidies or even tax subsidies for workers in those critical sectors, so that they can be able to also meet the challenges that they have in their day-to-day lives because of the depressed economies that are resultant as a result of this pandemic.
And this has certainly caught so many African countries, particularly the emerging market economies, off guard. And some countries have got limited budgets to deal with it. So even even the international players that most of these countries have been looking up to, such as China, such as the United States and European countries, have got their own problems with regards to containing and fighting COVID-19. So what kind of assistance can Africa expect from these countries, if at all?
Yes, certainly that is now the big challenge. A lot of funding that comes to Africa is donor funding, especially for the health sector. And traditionally, the donors are based in the Western world, but now here they are also faced with the same public health challenge. And so we see a lot of diversion of resources to deal with their own domestic issues. And so that only leaves for a coordinated approach at the regional level for African heads of state and through the African Union to perhaps lead some sort of an advocate for a fund, a global fund, whether at the IMF or World Bank level, to provide support to meet these measures that most African economies are thinking about. This fund will complement the already existing domestic reforms that are going on in terms of fiscal policies that these countries are undertaking. I think second to that, there has also been a discussion around African nations sort of being given a debt moratorium, which is essentially for them to suspend debt repayments so that they can utilize the funds that they have now towards addressing the critical needs that have come about as a result of the pandemic. And if that suspension of debt can happen, and this essentially involves bilateral talks between African nations and their debtors, as well as at the multilateral level in the case of multilateral financial institution debt, so that at least Africans can recognize in the unique challenge that Africa has and the difficult situation that we have with our debt position. If you remember, most African nations have been running large budget deficits year on year concurrently. And so we do not have enough headroom to even go out and borrow more debt or acquire more debt in order to address the mitigation measures that Africa is thinking of putting in place. And so if you have these two initiatives, essentially an Africa-wide fund to address some of the mitigation measures, as well as a debt moratorium to free up available funds that African nations have in order to divert those funds to implement the mitigation measures, might go a long way in providing relief for the most affected.
And having said that, which sectors of the economy that African countries should lavish more attention on so that their debt position is in a much better standing?
If you think about it, the most affected sectors are actually in the agriculture as well as the services sectors. And so if you consider the agricultural food chains, where you have from transportation to production and all that, and all requiring human capital to be involved, especially at close proximity, the moment you have social distancing and you have partial curfews and quarantine measures in place, you essentially bring that sector to a halt. And so food, therefore, and food distribution becomes affected. affecting the entire population. And so the agriculture sector is certainly one to think about. Secondly, is in the services sector. We know a lot of people are employed, for instance, in the hospitality sector. And given that tourism will now be depressed across all countries, and even domestic hospitality industries are actually closing down or putting on hold whatever economic activities that they had planned, we see that workers are being laid off and all that. And so if there is a safety net to sort of provide to help workers remain on payroll by providing some sort of subsidy to organizations within these sectors, it can go a long way in providing the cushion for the time where the curfew measures or quarantine measures have been put in place.
And more especially because, markets are very sensitive to sentiment, and negative sentiment has already reached levels last seen in the 2008 global financial crunch. Mr. David Owiro, Executive Director of the Africa Development Think Tank, thank you so much for your time.